Good afternoon. My name is Gideon Ruvenin. I'm the director of the Van Vel Institute of Jewish Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome everyone that has joined us today. We are delighted that so many of you are able to join to hear from our special guest speakers, Peter and George Summerfield. I'm sure that you all are very aware of how special their testimony is. Pretty easy to plan all this remotely, so we are pleased that you have been able to make it. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank Faye Brown from the University of Sussex Alumni Office for her tremendous work in setting up this event today. The theme of the Holocaust Memorial Day this year is "Be the light in the darkness." It encourages us to reflect on the depth that humanity can sink to, but also on the ways individuals and community have time and again resisted that darkness, demonstrating how even simple acts of kindness, understanding, and tolerance can be a light in the dark. Without, please welcome George and Peter Summerfield.
Well, my name is Peter Summerfield. I wasn't always that. I was born Klaus Peter Willi Sommerfeld. I've been a long member of the support group of the Center for German Jewish Studies at Sussex University. And each year, whenever possible, I've attended the annual event, the Holocaust Memorial event, which is organized by the university. We're very sorry this year they're having to do it virtually rather than being with you. The motto this year is "Be the light in the darkness." And I think it's very appropriate to think for a moment of Captain Tom, who unfortunately died with us yesterday. And we think because he also was the light in the darkness in the early year of the pandemic, which we're all having to suffer. George and I have also been through darkness, but we've also suffered kindness. We've had help from either Jewish and non-Jewish people, and that has helped us to escape. George and I escaped, as those who've seen the film will know, with the very last train from Berlin, just 4 days before the war started on the 1st of September, 1939. We arrived in England just with the clothes we were standing in. Fortunately, we were helped along the way, and that is something which we're going to be talking about and answering questions about if you'd like to put these to us. But before doing so, I just would like to ask George to introduce himself. George.
Right, my name is George Summerfield, but it wasn't always George Summerfield. I was actually born Günther Arthur Sommerfeld. This was in 1933. This was also the year that Hitler came to power and that the Nazis took over in Berlin, because at that time, as a Jewish family, we were immediately in trouble. Most of you will have read about that and will have seen the film that's been produced. But certainly as we go along with various questions, we will again run over some of the points that were made in the film. So do please ask us whatever you would like to know.
Okay, thank you. A number of questions were already submitted in advance, and I would like to invite my colleague Diana Franklin, who is the Center for German Jewish Study manager, to read out some of the questions. For those of you who would like now to pose questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of bottom of the screen. You are most welcome to do so, and we'll do our best to forward these questions to George and Peter. So I look forward to see or to hear also a lot of these questions and your answers, Peter. and George. So over to you, Diana.
Hello, Peter and George. Hello,
Hello,
everybody who's listening, watching this afternoon. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us this afternoon. And we're also delighted with the feedback that we've had from Peter and George's wonderful testimony, which they made. Bear Lefkowitz from the AJR made the film with them a few months ago. And I think many of you will have seen it now. And I have to tell you, Peter and George, the feedback has been fantastic. People are so very grateful to you both for what you've put on record for all of us, for generations to come. So we have some questions which have been sent in, and I shall start with an anonymous student. Many students these days are anonymous. Do you remember what you thought about at the time when you were leaving Germany? Do you think you realized the gravity of the situation, or were you too young?
Well, shall I begin with that? We were, of course, 6.5 years at the time. So we didn't know the reason why it was so urgent for my parents to leave and how desperate they were to leave the hell that Germany had become. But we were very conscious of the fact that this was really going to be a complete change in our lives from then on. We knew that my parents had had great difficulty in finding someone abroad who would sanction us, who would be able to foster us and pay for us. We also knew that all our luggage had been packed, but we at that time thought that we were going to see it again, which wasn't going to be the case. But we were very anxious with our parents, especially as we stood on the platform in Berlin, waiting for the train to arrive and for us to board and leave Germany forever. We realized then, especially as I remember my mother actually shedding some tears. It was very unusual for my mother to cry. I'm not sure why she cried, whether it was a question of relief that at last we were able to leave, or whether it was one of anxiety and apprehension as to what the future would bring. But all I know is that we were very crowded at the time. We were only seen by one person seeing us off. It was a niece of my mother, who unfortunately didn't make it, because although she had permission to come to England, she decided to pick up 2 dresses, as our testimony showed. And as a result, because she left 12 hours later, she only reached the border, was sent back, and was then later on murdered. So our feelings were one of apprehension, but we were too young really to understand the full implications. I'm not sure whether George would like to add to that.
No, I think that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. The next question is about your teddy bear. I hope you have your teddy bear.
That's Peter again, because mine, unfortunately, is no longer available.
Do you have the teddy with you, Peter?
Oh, of course I have the teddy bear with me.
Well,
here's Teddy, there.
See. So an anonymous student asks, he says that he was very, very sad to hear that the only remnant you have from your time in Germany was your teddy. And he wants to know the name of your bear.
Well, the name of my teddy bear is Teddy Bear, Teddy. I called him Teddy because, as it happens, the Germans didn't have a different name for Teddy. It was Teddy spelt differently, T-E-D-D-I, and bear was B-A umlaut, that's the 2 dots, and then E-R. But it was Teddy Bear, and I called him Teddy. And here he is, my teddy bear. The only thing I have of my first 6.5 years in Germany, and the only thing which I was carrying when we reached Liverpool Street Station in 1939, just with our hand luggage.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, my own teddy bear seems to have disappeared. So
I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you where it was. Yes. Shame. Okay.
But it was very similar, I can tell you that.
It was a twin, wasn't it?
Exact twin.
I now have a question from King's School in Hove and from Joseph from Chichester High School. The questions are quite similar. How did the German citizens treat you on a daily basis? And what did it make you feel? And Joseph also asks, how did the German people in Berlin treat you? So I guess it's the non-Jewish people that you met.
How did they speak to us?
How they treated you. If you felt you were treated differently once the Nuremberg laws came in.
Well, in fact, most of our memory at that stage would go back to the time when Peter and I were 5 years old. So it would be in the last 2 years of our existence in Berlin itself, because before that we were rather too young to understand what was happening. But certainly during that period, we found increasingly, as you will see from the film that we produced, that life for us became more difficult, not only for us, but for anyone who was Jewish. For one thing, our father had already been thrown out of his job, which was more or less at the time that we were born, so that purely in terms of our financial situation, it became increasingly bad for us. But also the relationship we had, for example, with not twins, but with friends of ours with whom we played in the courtyard, who one day came back crying and had been told by the school, for example, that they were not allowed to play with us anymore because we were Jewish. And that is something that, as a young person, one certainly remembers. We were later on very good friends with the parents, because not all the Germans at that time were Nazis. And certainly the relationship we had with the parents of these young boys, we continued until even after the war. Other things were happening to us in Berlin, which made life increasingly difficult. For example, we weren't allowed to go into most of the park, which we used to visit on a regular basis. Only a very small section was allowed for Jews. The main section had exact details there, Jews not allowed. This was the sort of thing that was happening to us all the time, so that gradually life became more difficult, and we ourselves began to realize that things were not normal.
May I just say this, though, that the Germans on the whole, they wouldn't even talk to us. Most Germans at the time, they were either carrying flags. We weren't allowed flags, of course. Otherwise, they had an emblem which showed that they were members of the Nazi party. So on the whole, there wasn't much communication there between Jews and non-Jews. In fact, the Nuremberg laws actually forbade that sort of relationship. That's why it was possible for Jewish men to divorce their non-Jewish wives, or the non-Jewish element would divorce the Jewish ones without any problems whatsoever, or else they would get a nullity of divorce if there were no children. So really there was very little contact. Germans on the whole were being fed this anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda, so they wouldn't want to be in contact with us. Here it was the Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, who was putting out terrible information about Jewish people. So non-Jewish people were keeping well away from them, because after all, according to Goebbels, Jewish people were vermin. We weren't even people. We were what they called Untermenschen, under people. In other words, we weren't real people. That's why Goebbels produced a film in which it showed Jewish people leaving a synagogue, and then immediately afterwards, rats leaving a sewer. So you can well imagine that the Germans had no time at all for Jewish people, other than later on when they could give them away, kill them, or take over their assets. The main things which Hitler wanted was to build up a war chest. And what better than to confiscate everything from Jewish people in order to build up that war chest? And this was, of course, great for the Germans in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany who were non-Jewish, because they were taking over the businesses, they were taking over the assets, they were taking over the housing, and we were being deprived of everything. I mean, George and I even had to give up our tricycles. We had to give up everything. And if anyone had a pet, we didn't have a pet, but we know people who did have a pet, and they had to give up that pet. And then the pet had to be destroyed, because the pet had been with Jewish people and had been contaminated by them. So you can well imagine that there was very little contact of a friendly nature. And that's why it was so important what George just mentioned, that the father and mother of those two children we played with, that was the caretaker and his wife, although they were non-Jewish, they were friendly. And later on, they were the ones who really helped us. They, in the end, were the light in the darkness, because without their help, later on, we could never have got out and we wouldn't be talking to you today.
Also, one of our main recollections is seeing the synagogue, which we had been to about a month earlier, actually the smoke coming from it, and it was burning away. Can you imagine what you would feel if, for example, your local church or the place where you'd worship, all of a sudden you find is alight? There were police and fire brigade there, but all they did was watch the fire take place. They were really there only to make sure that if there were any houses nearby that could be burnt by the fire, that they would then be saved. But as far as the synagogues all over the whole of Germany, they were just allowed to burn. That's the sort of remembrance that one has and that we saw on a regular basis while going to our school. It had to be a Jewish school. We couldn't go to a local one. We had to go to a Jewish school, which was about an hour away. Lots of things that were happening at that time that made life for us very difficult. And we could certainly see also the implication to our parents. Our father, for example, during the Kristallnacht, which was the worst day of all, having to take a position in the just to keep away from our flat and hide himself so that he wouldn't be arrested. And this is where we were helped, in fact, by the caretaker and his wife, who were the parents of the friends with whom we used to play.
Thank you very much. Actually, one student from Hove asked about if other synagogues were burnt, because obviously in your testimony you show your synagogue, which was on fire. But actually, I'm sure you'll tell the students that synagogues all over Germany at the time were set on fire, weren't they? I think apart from one. I think that's what I heard.
I think the only one that was not burnt was one in Berlin itself, but all the other synagogues were burnt. Hundreds of them were burnt on that day, and it was a state-sponsored killing, a state-sponsored arson. And in fact, they tried to hide the fact that there was actually the army involved, so they told the army to wear civilian clothes. But from one day to the next, this happened. No one knew, if they were Jewish, that this was going to happen. I mean, my late father-in-law was dragged out of bed. And on the 9th of November, 1938, for Kristallnacht, and taken off to Buchenwald concentration camp. He'd done nothing. He was no reason for doing it. And it was just because he happened to be Jewish. But in fact, 30,000 other Jewish men on that day were dragged off to concentration camp, and they prepared the way for them. Although when they did reach concentration camp, there was not even enough room for some of them to go into barracks. And I know that my late father-in-law even had to sleep outside the first night because there was no room inside a barrack. And remember, this was November 1938. November is very cold. Germany happens to be even colder than England during that month. So you can imagine how he must have felt on that day, suddenly being dragged out of bed and having to sleep in the open air outside a barrack room in Buchenwald.
Just thank you for that. Just going back to the story of when your mother had to take you all the way on the train to the Jewish school because you were no longer allowed to go to the regular school. One student is asking what your mother, you explained that she couldn't go to the cinema, she couldn't go to a park, she couldn't go to a shop. And one student is asking if she was able to sit down. Was there a bench she could sit on?
It so happened that the kindergarten we had to go to was the other side of Berlin. And therefore mother took us there, and for 3 or 4 hours she had to wait for us. But there was nowhere that she could go. It was not allowed to go to a restaurant or to a cafe. There happened to be no park nearby where she could have sat on a yellow bench, which was allowed, but not a green bench, of course. And she wasn't allowed to go to the theater, to the cinema. There was nothing she could do, so she would just walk up and down, waiting for us to come out. That's quite right.
And the answer to that question is that there was really nowhere that she could stay and have some rest. She
Well, that's what I said, yes.
Thank you. Now people are asking about your journey to Britain. Wondering, Jake from Chichester High School asks how long the total journey took. How long from leaving Berlin till you actually got to Liverpool Street Station?
Well, the journey itself took, I would say, about 2 days.
2 days,
But
yes.
but it was made more difficult, or perhaps 2.5 days, but it was made more difficult because when we got to the border, instead of being allowed through in the normal way, we found that the train that we had taken from Berlin to Bentheim, which was the border town, the Nazi, still the Nazi one, they made us all get off the train, leave our luggage on the train, only take whatever we had as hand luggage into the area there where they were testing
The immigration hall.
making sure that we had all the passports that we needed. And then the train drew away and went back into proper Germany itself. And we never saw any of that luggage again. And we spent an extra night in Bentheim station, surrounded by the Nazi troopers there, and hoping only that we would get away. So that was quite an experience that we had. Fortunately, the next day, there was a local train, a Dutch train, which allowed us to escape because it allowed us to get out of the German border into Holland itself. And once we were in Holland, well, then that made that journey back as a reasonably normal one, although we still had to take quite a number of changes within Holland itself because we were no longer on what I would call a main train. But after that, the journey was not too bad. And that's so the whole thing probably took roughly about 3 days.
Thank you. A pupil from Oriel High School, he asks if, or he or she, I don't know who it is, do you have any relatives in Germany? And have you been back as adults to any of the places you mention in the film?
Well, let me first of all say that the nearest relatives of ours who were actually murdered were our grandmother was murdered. She was murdered in Theresienstadt concentration camp. And our uncle, the brother of my father, was murdered in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. So they're the nearest relatives. There was, of course, the niece I mentioned who saw us off, niece of my mother, who saw us off at the station. And the only reason she couldn't come with us was because she had to pick up these 2 dresses from the dressmaker on the following day. And that made all the difference for her between life and death. Her husband had been able to get to England because he'd found a job in England. And he was waiting for her. He'd only been married to her for about 4 months, but she never arrived. And of course, that was dreadful for him. He never got married after that. We did see him during the war. But so I think, have I answered the question there? I'm not quite sure.
Well, yes. I think the question really was whether anyone survived.
Yes.
Do you have
well, the grandmother who helped us, and we'll probably come to that in a minute, and who told us to leave earlier than we intended to, she died a natural death, thank goodness. And so she wasn't sent off to concentration camp, because women from Berlin were only sent off to concentration camp about 1941, 2 years after the war began. So she was alive for a little while. Fortunately, she died a natural death, which was much better than being taken off to concentration camp. But unfortunately, my wife, she lost both her grandmothers. I mean, unfortunately, there was no one in England who would give them a job. There was no one who was able to sponsor them, and therefore they had to remain in Germany, much, of course, to the dismay of my late mother-in-law and late father-in-law, and of course, my wife. And they had to stay in Germany, and then they were then sent from Breslau to Lithuania for 3 days in a cattle truck. And in Lithuania, the day after they arrived, they were taken to dig a pit, and then they were shot together with, I think, 5,000 other men, women, and children on the day after. So we lost those relatives as well. And of course, what the terrible thing, I think, is that the children, they weren't even shot because they felt that it was a waste of bullets. So what they did is they just threw them into the pit. They usually died of suffocation. But those are the relatives, and those are the ones we unfortunately lost. But of course, altogether, 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. And of those, 1,500,000 were children, for no other reason than they happened to be Jewish.
And in fact, we have no relatives in England as such. The only relatives we had when we arrived were in what was then known as Palestine, because the two sisters had gone, of our mother, had gone to Palestine and were living there. Fortunately, they were also able to send us a little bit of money which we needed desperately when we arrived, because when we arrived, we were penniless and unexpected. So at that time, that was very helpful to us.
We did have a distant uncle in America, the one who was prepared to give us the affidavit which we desperately needed to be able to get out. He was the one who was prepared to sponsor us, another one of the light in the darkness.
But on the other hand, we did not make America, because the ships were being bombed by the U-boats. Young people in particular were not being allowed to travel anymore. And that is why we made our life in England, which both Peter and I now, I think, was very fortunate.
Well, we're very pleased to be here rather than certainly not be here.
That ties in very well.
And on the one hand, that we managed to get away from Berlin, because had we left another 10 hours later, you would not be speaking to us today. You wouldn't be here. So that made all the difference in our lives. And of course, I think we're both quite fortunate to have stayed in England, because we have enjoyed our lives here.
Well, from a pupil from Malay School says, do you feel more grateful for your lives today, considering what you went through? So
Are we more grateful?
More grateful?
Yes.
Hard to measure. Yes?
I think we've just both said that. We're very grateful indeed, because very few countries took people in. This was one of the most unfortunate things, because the Jewish people in Germany were clamoring. They were begging countries to take them, but there were only two ways in which you could get out. Either you had to find someone who would be financially responsible, a sponsor, or you had to find someone who would give you a job. And this was a difficulty. People were, the world on the whole was in some depression after the First World War. And so most countries just were not prepared to take Jewish people in. In fact, the Americans and the British did call a conference. They called a conference in Evian, which is on the border of Switzerland and Germany. They called this conference in 1938. And the idea was to get about 30 countries together to see what can be done to help the Jews. That conference lasted about a week, but it had no result whatsoever. I'm told that mainly because there happened to be a very nice golf course right next to the conference center. So most of the delegates spent more time in the golf course than they were in the actual conference room. But whatever happened, very little came out of it. People weren't prepared to help. And that's, of course, which gave Hitler the green light. He said, well, if people don't care about the Jewish people, if people are allowed to be anti-Semitic, if they're allowed to treat Jews as vermin and not as proper people, I can do what I like. And this then gave him the incentive to go ahead and start this terrible state-sponsored ravaging of Kristallnacht, when, of course, not only shops and businesses were actually trashed, but people were killed, and as I said earlier, people thrown into concentration camp.
Thank you. We have a set of twins from Malay School asking a question. They say, do you think your parents were particularly worried by the fact that you were twins, and that in some way this might attract negative attention?
I think really the opposite, I would say, because I think any twins are always recognized immediately as twins, and people do tend to go towards them and make friends with them as well. So I think that if anything, there were two reasons. One is that people anyway were very kind to us as we were twins anyway, and partly also because at that time, each of us was never alone. We always had the other to help. And I think that it gives you a very positive plus, if you like, in your life. We were immediately noticed. For example, when we first arrived in England, we went to a school next door, and when they heard that twins had just arrived, they immediately asked us whether we would like to come across free of charge and learn some English, because we spoke only German at that time. I think the fact that we were twins made it, gave them an extra impulse to invite us. And I do think, if anything, it's always been an advantage. In fact, our lives were very, very combined all the time, but were very, very similar. Even when we did our national service, our army service for 2 years, the fact that we were twins meant that we were allowed to keep each other, because that was an authority given by the government, provided that each had a similar medical background, which fortunately we did have. So that even in the army and also later on at university, the fact that we were together was an advantage, and we made many friends, even more friends, I think, because people did enjoy getting to know twins. It was, if anything, positive rather than negative.
But every plus also has a minus. And of course, the fact that we were twins meant that if we had not escaped from Germany, we could well have been sent to concentration camp and there fallen into the hands of Mengele. Mengele was the famous German Nazi doctor at Auschwitz, who delighted in making experiments on twins, usually completely medically unsuited and unintelligible, even operations and so on twins. And we could easily fall into the hands of someone like Mengele, and our end would have been terrible, and probably because he did most of the operations without anesthetic and without any good reason for doing them. So although it was very good to be a twin, and we always enjoyed the fact that we could be together, that was great. But I would say one thing about our army service, and that is that when we were in Egypt, where we were actually on active service, when we were on missions, which were obviously going to be dangerous, they tried to separate us so that if something happened to one of us, the other would survive.
Right. Well, thank you. A pupil from King's School in Hove wants to know if you ever heard what happened to the children of your caretaker, with whom you were not allowed to play anymore. Did you ever hear any more about them after the war?
That's an interesting question. The answer is yes, because for one thing, the parents were very helpful to us at all stages. First of all, we weren't allowed to play with the children anymore, but the parents were still very helpful to our parents. And they also helped our father hide himself when the occasion needed it. So we had a very good relationship. They also helped us financially, because the one thing that the Germans always did is they took all our money. And when it came to the journey from Berlin, and we decided to go by train via Holland to England, my father did not even have enough money left to pay for the train journey on that Saturday night. And this family, the caretaker and his wife, lent us the money. So after the war, we heard that they had survived, and we sent the money back to them, of course, and even sent them some additional food, because they were very short of food as well in Berlin, and not only in London at the time. So there has definitely been, there was definitely contact with them afterwards. And even now, there is an occasion that we're working on at the moment with someone else, where we're trying to find out whether, in fact, any of that family are still in existence, and whether
we're still trying to get in touch with them even now. I think we should leave it at that. Yes.
Yes. Well, that was a question from another pupil who wanted to know if they were still alive and if you'd had any contact. So you've answered.
We are endeavouring to find whether.
Leave it at that, George. I think we shouldn't talk about that.
Okay. There's a question from King's School in Hove, asking what that you lost. So I guess part of, I don't know whether this is about emotionally or whether this is physical artifacts, but what do you feel you lost that you remember from your time in Berlin? Obviously, everything was taken away by the Nazis. They stole all your, everything that you had. So I'm just wondering if, or the pupils are wondering, if there are items that you remember that you lost, which you were sad about.
I remember losing the, as I said, the tricycles, which we weren't allowed to have. I also remember that to begin with, we weren't even allowed to listen to the radio. But on the whole, I can't think of very much which we've really lost. I always think of what we've gained rather than what we've lost. Because in Germany, we were young. We didn't have many toys, but we did have some toys. First, when we came to England, we had no toys at all. Parents had no money. So from that point of view, I suppose we rather remembered what we had in Germany and were rather sad to have lost it. But I don't think there's anything very great which we've lost. But what we have lost, I suppose, is that Germany was a very cultured, educated country and had a great deal to offer in those areas. And I suppose if we'd grown up in Germany, we could have benefited from that as the rest of the world has benefited. But that's minor. What we gained was we gained our freedom. In Germany, we had no freedom whatsoever. The noose was gradually getting tighter and tighter around the neck of my parents and also our necks, because we were obviously involved with them all the time. So I don't think we lost anything in Germany. We've gained by coming to this country. And we're very grateful for everything that's been done for us here.
I would agree with Peter there, because I think that what was positive was the life that we were beginning to lead there. And obviously also in wartime, it was a question of survival, because soon after we arrived, the aircraft used to come on a regular basis. It was the time of the Nazi
the Blitzkrieg.
And then also we were hiding in shelters. As you know, if you've read seen the film that we've produced, we were actually sleeping in Tottenham Court Road Underground for a period of about 5 months every night from 3 o'clock onwards. So at that time, one's work really was cut out looking after oneself and surviving, and hoping that, for example, at the end of a night in the underground, that when you came back to the place where we were living with our one room, that room would still be standing and not bombed out. So it was very much a question of survival in those early years.
But could I make one further point, is that we arrived with no language. So of course, what we lost is the ability to be able to speak and communicate to begin with. We had to learn afresh. I think that is a good point.
That is a good point. I mean, you were lucky you had each other to speak to.
Yes.
But of course, absolutely, you had to completely...
Originally, we just spoke German to each other.
I'm sure. A pupil from Recoding School asks how your experiences have affected how you view Germans and Germany today.
Well, my wife and I, and also George at one stage, we are invited every year to go to Berlin, and they pay for us to stay there for at least a week in order to be able to speak to non-Jewish students there. So we have quite a lot of contact with Germans even now. And on the whole, we found that the present generation in particular are totally different, and we get nothing but kindness, interest, and to some extent, a feeling of guilt. A lot of them feel guilty. What did their grandparents do during the war? But when it comes to older people, we have a different reaction. If they could have been in the war as Nazis, they must nowadays be something in their 90s, in their 90th year or so, because after all, it's 75 years, 76 years since the war finished. And there we try and stay away from them as far as possible. We won't have nothing to do with them. But if they're younger people, you can't blame younger people for what their ancestors did. So we try to speak to them and try to understand them and get them to understand us and for them to understand what happened to us so that hopefully this will not happen again in the future. I don't know whether George would like to add to that.
No, and in fact, a large number of the younger Germans have made a deliberate effort to go and visit Israel itself. And a large number of them have gone to live in kibbutz for a while and begin to see what life was like in the Jewish situation in Israel. So at the moment, I think there's a completely different contrast. And certainly, as Peter has said, I don't think that we feel any problem with any of the Germans that we meet. On the contrary, I think most of them enjoy our relationship.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. One question about your passport. A pupil has asked me why you were all on the same passport. They wanted to know if that was common, or if that was the way a family was always on one passport.
It's most uncommon. I've never heard of any other. And this is the actual passport itself. And it shows a photograph of my parents, and it shows us, there's a ring round where we are there. And it's most unusual. Thank God we had this, because it was very usual at that time for the father or the husband to go ahead and prepare the way. But because we had one passport, we all had to travel together. In the case of the niece of my mother, the husband of a few weeks had gone ahead to prepare the way. My father couldn't do that. We had to travel together, and thank God for that. But very interestingly, you see, every passport, every document, Jewish document, had a big J on it, as you can see the big J here as well. That's true also of the identity card, which everyone had to carry. It had a J in the front. It had a J inside as well. This is my mother's actual identity card. And it even had her fingerprints in it. And also very interesting is that every German document had to have, the Jewish person had to have a Jewish name. Every woman had to have the name Sarah on every document, and every man had to have the name Israel, every man, every boy. That's why our passports show the name Israel for my father and my brother and myself, and Sarah for my mother. Again, it's humiliation as well, and it's also something so that they can immediately recognize that you are Jewish. Later on, of course, they had the yellow star, but that didn't arise until about 1940, 1939, 1940. It's when Germany invaded other countries that they forced Jewish people to wear a star. And it was then, of course, that the real killing, first by shooting, started, and then later on, it ended up with gas chambers.
Thank you. Another pupil wants to know if you knew other children that left Germany, and perhaps if you made friends with other Holocaust survivors, well, refugees from Germany, if you made friends with others when you came to this country.
I think that when we first came to this country, we did in fact tend to make people with a similar background our main friends, so that we lived in an area of London in particular where a large number of refugees were living, and obviously some of them had children, but there weren't all that many children in our age group, partly because we were born in 1933. After that, trouble became more difficult on a yearly basis, so that those Jewish families that were still living,
Jewish people just didn't want to have children after that anymore.
The Jewish people who are living in Germany were still not keen or not necessarily able to have children for the reason that life was becoming more and more difficult.
They didn't wish to have children.
Well, would you like to continue, Peter?
Yes, I think it's very important to know that there was a definite feeling that it's not the time to bring children to the world.
Which is what I was saying, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I understand that, because the birth rate fell drastically, didn't it? And did you make friends? So did you make friends eventually in this country with?
The answer was yes, we did.
From Germany.
There were very few of them around, as George has mentioned, but with those that were around, especially in our synagogue, we joined a synagogue which was originally founded by people who came from the continent, because we wanted to carry on the same religious traditions. And there were just a few, usually about 3 or 4 years older than we were, and they did become our friends. And also at that time, both George and I were rather keen to sing and to dance. We learned tap dancing, and we also entertained the refugee community, because there was no television, there was nothing really for them to do very much, and they couldn't understand English, most of the people. So we did quite a lot of actual entertaining of Jewish refugees. And later on, we also entertained the army, especially the American Navy, because the Navy was here waiting to go into France for D-Day. That's the time when they actually invaded France in 1944. So they were here, and we used to entertain them. They had naval uniforms to be able to do that.
Right.
But of course, the relationship spread much more. We went to a local grammar school after having passed our 11 plus. And although there were other Jewish children there, we were obviously spreading with everyone else. And I think that the one big aim that both Peter and I had from the beginning, really from the moment that we first arrived in England, was to be British. I think that if anything, the one thing we wanted was to be thought of and accepted entirely as British. One of the reasons why, for example, when other people were annoyed at having to do national service, 2 years in the Army, Navy and Air Force, when you're roughly about 18 or 19 years old, Peter and I were actually looking forward to it, because it was our way of showing our gratitude for having been accepted here so fully by everyone British. So if anything, the one thing we wanted to avoid at all times was to be known as Jewish in origin. And we would never tell anyone, if we could avoid it, we would always want to be accepted completely as British.
Right.
In fact, we kept the fact that we were born in Germany, we kept it hidden. When we were at school, when we were in the army, when we were even at university, we didn't tell people. They knew we were Jewish. We didn't hide that. There was no reason to hide it. But we did hide the fact that we were Germans. To begin with, the Germans were the enemy. And in fact, to some extent, we were bullied when we were very young, because people thought we were Germans and we were the enemy. But even later on, we just kept that very quiet, so that even our friends at university didn't know that we were originally from Germany, until we had a celebration 50 years after we started at Pembroke College at Oxford. And at that point, we mentioned it for the first time. But we're now getting on to our education in England. And I think we should say that George has mentioned grammar school. Perhaps you'd like to carry on with that, George, as to what happened to us in grammar school, how we managed to get to university.
Well, certainly one had the 11 plus then, and we did our O level and A level. But before going to university, one needed to go for naturalization to national service, and we did 2 years of army, so that by the time we were 21, in fact, was before we got to university. And so for 3 years at university, we were 24 years old by the time we completed that. But certainly it was only 50 years after we finished at university, when Peter and I were invited to a 50th anniversary at Pembroke College, that we discovered, each of us, we were in a separate group, that without having any previous agreement on this, that each of us accepted and told that our initial birth was in Germany and not in England. That was the first time that we actually became public about it, which I think, if anything, shows how much we feel that we want to be accepted fully as British, and how happy we are to be.
I would like to add one thing, and that is this. We were very much helped at school by a very supportive headmaster. And as a result, we both won scholarships to go to Oxford for 3 years. We were completely paid for by the state. My parents had no money, At that time, they'd only just about started working. They hadn't even been allowed to work to begin with, because we were only in England on a stepping stone to America. But now we both, having worked, we were fortunate and we were able to win scholarships. And if you think about it, it's wonderful that having arrived penniless in London, we were now being helped by the state to study for 3 years at the expense of the state. It's a wonderful thing that England was able to do that. Nowadays, people trying to get to university have much more difficulty. They're lucky if they can get a loan. But we were very fortunate, and of course, we both benefited as a result.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I just want to ask you another question from Upland School. Do you have advice for the younger generation today? I think you're both seen as such inspirations. They want some advice, please, for the younger generation.
Well, I think you start, George.
Well, I would say certainly, I think what is important is to do one's best in anything one attempts. I think that's terribly important, particularly now, of course, so many young children or people at university have got the extra problem of the COVID-19. So I think that in any situation, always do make the best and try and achieve whatever you aim for as much as you can.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, my advice is that you've got to be persistent. You've got to be like Captain Tom, and you've got to do your best at all times. And you must remember that what is important is what the person is like. When you're looking at a person, it doesn't matter whether they happen to be a different color, whether they happen to be a different religion. That is immaterial. You can't tell what a book is going to be about by looking at its cover. In the same way, you must treat people for what they are. If they're good people, if they're worthy people, then support them, be friends with them. But try and understand that we're made of different people, but in the end, we're all the same. We all get born the same, we all die the same. We're all flesh and blood, and we should respect each other. What is important is to respect each other. Auschwitz wasn't the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story was there was indifference. What I'm saying to you is don't be indifferent. If you see anti-Semitism, if you see any form of racism, try and stop it. Be active. Try and be good. You've got a choice. Everyone has a choice. They can be good or they can be bad. Try and choose for a good life and try and choose to do something which is good and not to do something which is evil. Nazism, fascism, racism is evil. There's so much in the world which is good. Let good prosper, let evil die out.
And I would also add, just try to avoid bullying, because there's nothing worse than bullying. Accept other people fully for what they are and try and prove to them that who you are should be accepted by you as well as you should accept them. In other words, that is terribly important in life.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I cannot thank you enough. You've been a true inspiration to us all. Your testimony on the film, anyone who hasn't seen it will be able to have a link to it and they can watch it afterwards. I think many people will want to watch it again in months and years to come. This has absolutely been fantastic. I'm sorry you weren't in the university, but I have to say, perhaps we're lucky in some way because we've had so many more people watching today than we would have had in Sussex University. So maybe in the future you'll come to Sussex, because there'll be many more generations of students who'd love to see you and would be inspired by you. So I just thank you so sincerely for an absolutely wonderful, inspiring presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you, Diana, as well. And thank you, Gideon, for everything you did as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.